Welcome to Headliners of Service, our virtual speakers series presented by the Global Service Institute at Long Island University, featuring engaging conversations with exceptional leaders from all walks of life. These inspiring, timely, and fascinating discussions are hosted by Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby, the chair of the Global Service Institute. Today's headliner is Secretary Ben Carson. The distinguished retired neurosurgeon is the 17th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and is a key member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. During this presentation, we invite all of you to ask questions in the Q&A box, and we will have our guest answer as many as possible later in the program. You can also email them right now to questions@globalserviceinstitute.org. Everyone, please welcome Rita Cosby.
Hello, everybody. I am Rita Cosby, and welcome to our Headliners of Service Speakers Series. We have today certainly somebody who is deeply accomplished in many arenas, Secretary Ben Carson. And Secretary Carson, we're so happy that you're here, especially with your very busy schedule. Thank you for making the time for us.
So good to be with you, Rita. Thank you.
I cannot imagine how busy you are. There you are at the head of the Housing and Urban Development. You're also a member of the Coronavirus Task Force. How intense is it just for you personally? There's so much that you're juggling and so many people on your team.
Well, you said the key word there, team. We have some of the best people. I always say at HUD, we have the ugliest building and the best people. And that helps tremendously. So when I'm traveling, I know things are being taken care of appropriately. And I have a lot of people who could be retired or could be doing something else, making a lot of money, and they feel very dedicated to the service aspect of what they're doing and trying to make life better for Americans.
Well, there's a lot on your plate, Secretary Carson, and your team, as you talk about. First off, I do have to ask you, of course, the president has come back to the White House. There you are, a member of the Coronavirus Task Force. Are you amazed what seems to be a very fast recovery for the president?
I'm not amazed because we call him the Energizer Bunny. I mean, the man has more energy than anybody. And I would expect him to be able to conquer this pretty quickly. Also, do recognize that over these 6 to 8 months that this virus has been plaguing us, we have learned a lot about it and made tremendous progress in terms of the treatments for it. So that's really what the president was talking about when he said we don't have to fear this. It was basically the same thing that FDR said, during World War II. He said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because that fear sometimes makes you do irrational things. And we just need to be rational, take what we've learned from this and utilize that in order to be able to function well as a society while keeping it under the best control.
You know, one of the things the president said that in most populations, that it is not as lethal as the flu. What's your sense being a member of the Coronavirus Task Force?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the survival rate for the 0 to 19 age group, the school age group, is 99.997%. I mean, that's incredible. And even for the president's age group, over 70, it's 94.7%. So, those are survival rates that are better than the traditional flu. And I think that's what you're referring to. But it is more contagious. It is highly contagious. So we have to treat it in a different way than we treat other things. But it's so important that we don't become hysterical and start doing things that are just not rational. If we destroy the economy, a lot more people will die from poverty than would ever die from the flu. So we have to really keep things in perspective, not take it lightly by any stretch of the imagination, but use our intellect to act in a rational fashion so that we can control it while at the same time, keeping our society functional.
And Secretary Carson, you have been involved, I think about, your amazing life, also as a neurosurgeon, a doctor for so long. You've been involved, I think, in some of the most amazing miracles, separating conjoined twins, for example. Where are we with a vaccine? What's your sense on how close we are?
Well, we have three that are in phase 3 trials. To have that happen this quickly is amazing. It required a lot of cooperation between people who normally are rivals. And I give the president a lot of credit for that, facilitating those relationships. But, some people are concerned that we're rushing it through and that it's not safe. They don't understand how these trials work. To go from phase 1 to phase 2, you have to check all the boxes. If you don't check the boxes, you don't go to phase 2. To go from phase 2 to phase 3, you got to check all the boxes. If you don't check them, you don't go to phase 3. And you got to check the boxes in phase 3. You got to have statistical significance. So things are moving along rapidly, but appropriately, and no shortcuts are being taken. And when we get something, I think it will be real. The only question is, will the virus have mutated by that time? That's always an issue with viruses, but this one is showing no signs of mutation, which makes you wonder about its origins, quite frankly.
That's interesting. What do you suggest from the fact that it isn't mutating, what you're saying about the origins? That's interesting.
Well, it could be something that was created and induced as opposed to a naturally occurring virus.
Created as from somewhere, you're referring to in China or somewhere?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to. It makes you wonder about that, no question about it.
How much do you wonder about that as a scientist, personally?
Well, it's acting in a very unusual way. It doesn't act like, we get viruses all the time. Almost every year we have flu viruses, and they kill a lot of people. And but this one, in the way that it is spread, in its persistence, is unusual. And the fact that it's just sort of sitting there and it's not mutating and it's not changing, you do have to wonder about where it came from. Doesn't change the fact that we're making tremendous progress in terms of getting it under control. And that's the thing that we need to focus on. And I think a lot of credit is to be deserved by, our scientific community that has worked so hard to get this done.
It's amazing too to see, and even the president himself receiving some of the cutting edge treatment that's still obviously being tested. How far away, though, from a vaccine do you think? Are we weeks away? Are we months away? Where do you think we are, Dr. Carson?
Well, I think that there's a strong likelihood that we will have one before the end of this year.
You do, and you feel it will be safe. Do you think it's one or two or multiple, or?
I think we probably have more than one. And so people will have choices. Unfortunately, there have been some people poisoning the atmosphere and frightening people about vaccines, and that's unfortunate. But we'll get through that as well.
And I want to talk with you about another area too, because you're right there on the forefront with the housing and urban development, of course, leading with the economy. I can't imagine, if you ever sleep and if you're ever going to sleep, especially in the next coming weeks. But how tough has it been with the coronavirus and affordable housing, which, there never seems to be enough of it in general. But I can't imagine how much, because so many people are hit so hard with the economy right now. Right. And how unbelievable is the demand for housing?
Well, obviously the demand is heightened. It was already very high. We had an affordable housing crisis, really, which is why the president impaneled the council on removing the barriers to affordable houses. It's a multi-agency council, which I happen to chair. And, we're looking at all kinds of solutions, but, with respect to the coronavirus pandemic that occurred, we moved very rapidly to enact with the financial institutions forbearance to reduce significantly foreclosures and evictions, ways to recertify the income of people who were in subsidized housing, use of the CARES Act funding and dispersing it very quickly in order to mitigate any problems with the eviction crisis. And I think that's probably the reason that it hasn't occurred yet, but it does mean that we need to get things opened back up again so that it doesn't occur, because we can't go on indefinitely like that. And also the White House Council on Opportunity and Revitalization has been refocused by the president on looking at those factors that cause the virus to be more deadly in certain populations, African Americans, Hispanics. And, so we're looking not only at the comorbidities like hypertension and diabetes and obesity and asthma and things like that. We're looking at why are those things happening in those communities. So we're going to the next layer under and attacking it at that level. And that means, we have to look at housing situations. We have to look at employment situations. We have to look at the ability to get healthy food. We have to look at long-term health care, not just the van coming in over the weekend and taking everybody's blood pressure, but we have to look at long-term care. And perhaps the most important thing, and one that wouldn't occur immediately to people, is education and educational choice and quality education. If there is one factor that gets people out of poverty, it's education. And it makes it hard to understand why some in the political arena are against, educational choice. But it's something that is going to be pushed very hard. It's one of the reasons that we've made so much emphasis on the proliferation of broadband, because one thing that seems to be changing a lot is distal learning, distal conferencing, teleworking. And after every major pandemic historically, huge societal changes occur. I think that's going to be the one that occurs after this one. A lot more people will be working from home. Things will change. Interestingly enough, on the housing front, because a lot of office buildings will not be fully occupied anymore, there may be an opportunity to repurpose some of that for housing space.
Oh, that's interesting.
A lot of things will change.
One of the things you talked about also, Secretary Carson, I know opportunity zones, as you touched on there, but also Envision Centers is an interesting concept. And I know that you just opened up one recently. I mean, they've been in a number of places across the country, but another one in West Virginia just recently. And one thing I thought was really interesting is you're talking about education. One of the things we care about very deeply is obviously character, leadership. And I thought that was really fascinating that that's one of the components that you have there in the Envision Centers. Talk about why that is so important for people to turn their lives around.
Well, the whole concept of Envision Centers comes from the Bible. And the book of Proverbs, it says, without a vision, the people perish. And there were a lot of people perishing for a lot of reasons of, being hopeless and adrift. And we said, what can we do to set these people on a path, not of just patting them on the head and saying, there, you poor little thing, we'll take care of you. But how do we get them to climb those ladders of opportunity and to participate in the American dream? And we established 4 pillars: health and wellness, character and leadership, economic empowerment, and educational advancement. And create these centers generally in areas where there is subsidized housing and lack of opportunity, and to bring under one roof the multitudinous things that exist to help people. But they're all over the city, they're all over the county. So, somebody, particularly if they're working a low wage job, they're not going to have an opportunity to really avail themselves of all those things that exist. But if you bring them under one roof and you coordinate them, all of a sudden, that teenage mom can find out how to get appropriate childcare, can get her GED, can get another advanced degree to move on to become self-sufficient, teach self-sufficiency to her children, and break those cycles of poverty. That's what we're looking to do. Otherwise, we just continue to accumulate more dependent people, and eventually the weight of that becomes more than the society can tolerate. And I think that's the reason that God gave us these big brains, so we could figure these things out ahead of time and do what is necessary in order to avert problems later on.
Well, and also, boy, what a complex situation right now, and how important to be able to help everybody rise up. It's so important. We also opened it up to our audience for questions, and I've got one for you. This is from Ryan, Secretary Carson, and he asks, what current steps is HUD taking to incentivize home buying in the current real estate market?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at is credit. And how is credit established? And, particularly for some younger people, sometimes it becomes extremely difficult for them because they're young. They haven't had a chance to do things yet. But there are other things that they have done that demonstrate whether or not they're trustworthy. And so we're looking at some of those kinds of things. And also, for people who are renters, have they been consistent in paying their rent? Have they been consistent in paying their utilities? They may not have all the traditional manifestations of good credit, but those are pretty good indicators also. So we're working hard to try to increase the ability of people to own homes, but doing it very carefully, because as you remember, before the housing crisis, more than a decade ago, people were coming up with all kinds of flimsy things, and they were putting people into houses that they couldn't afford. And that's not really doing anybody any favors, because they lose the house, they lose their credit, and they lose their future possibilities. That was really one of the most cruel things anybody could possibly do. So those lessons are being kept in mind as we look for ways. And the reason that's so important is because the average net worth of a renter is $5,000. The average net worth of a homeowner is $200,000. That's a 40-fold difference. That accounts for a lot of the wealth gap that exists. And, that gap was being closed pre-COVID because the unemployment rates were so low. In the African-American community, it was the lowest unemployment ever recorded. And accordingly, African-American household income had gone up 7.9%, which was more than any other group, and it was closing the wealth gap. So, the whole concept of a rising tide lifts all boats is a very good concept. It's one that President Trump believes in tremendously, and one that I believe in tremendously. Do the things that help everybody. And that's why we're called United States, right? We want to help everybody. We don't want to pick one group over another group.
And got another question for you from Mahendra. And this is an interesting question, stating that many people are concerned, as a lot of people are, about a second wave of COVID in the fall. And that's something even Dr. Fauci talked about, a concern maybe for some parts of the country in Thanksgiving time, even, or even earlier. And she asked specifically that many young people, like in New York City at Washington Square, were seen dancing just a couple weeks ago, sort of without any regard to the impact of the suffering of others that could come 2 to 4 weeks later, as we see, or even earlier. Her question is, Dr. Carson, what is your advice to local and state leaders to control this type of behavior by the young generation before it causes harm to others?
Well, there is the possibility of a second wave. The good thing about that is that we've learned a whole lot about this virus. So we're going to be able to deal with, if there is a second wave, much more effectively than we dealt with the first wave, that's for sure. But education is really the key for the young people. And they need to recognize that even though their likelihood of being adversely affected by the virus is small, the likelihood of their transmitting it is large if they don't observe the kinds of precautions that have been recommended. So we need to emphasize the concept of caring about other people. Forget about all this me first, what about me stuff. And let's think about the health of our society. And the more we emphasize that, I think the more it will come across. Keep in mind that a lot of our young adults have grown up in an atmosphere where they're taught, always think about me first, and how does this feel for me? And I'm not sure that that is the best societal model. I think we have to think about the people around us as well. And any society that does that will be better off.
Is there anything that state or local officials could do? And obviously it's parents too, it's all of us really.
Well, I think I would much rather do this by convincing people than by mandating things. Mandating it's just not the American way. And you'll see, I mean, look at the difference that has occurred. I was walking to the airport and I said, I wonder how many people will have masks on. I only found 2 people. This was in Chicago. I only saw 2 people without a mask on. So, and it's not, done in a demanding top-down way, but I think people are being educated and they're starting to learn and they're starting to think about others. And, that's the American way. That's something that we need to emphasize much, much more because, we, the American people, are not each other's enemies. And, I recently saw a story on television about 2 neighbors. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat. And they were just good friends and they were taking photographs together and they don't denigrate each other for their beliefs. And, isn't that the way it should be? People are different and they have different experiences and they have different beliefs. It doesn't have to make them enemies. As I always say, if 2 people think the same about everything, one of them isn't necessary. So,
and you always have a good say. You have a saying too that it's the United States of America, and we should be united too. I love that phrase, Dr. Carson.
Exactly, not the divided states, but the United States, and that's what makes us strong.
I want to wrap up with my final question to you, just because I know of your amazing life story. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for years, Dr. Carson, and I think about where you have come from Detroit. You're someone who has been there. When you talk about affordable housing, I know your family was on food stamps. What do you attribute your success to? What's your message to other people?
That's a very good question. The primary thing I attribute it to is my faith in God. But I also had an amazing mother. If anybody was a victim, she was. Grew up in the worst circumstances in rural Tennessee, a huge family, got married when she was 13. Years later, discovered her husband was a bigamist, had the benefit of no more than a 3rd grade education, was functionally illiterate. But she refused to be a victim. And she refused to let us be victims. And she was always saying, you have yourself to blame. It doesn't matter what anybody else did. She says, you have a brain. Therefore, you could have thought your way around it or out of it. And I dare say, if everybody had my mother, we wouldn't have any problems. in our society today.
I wish I could have adopted her.
It makes a big difference, but also she emphasized so much education. And, we didn't like it very much in the beginning when she made us turn the TV off and start reading. But after a while, we started enjoying reading more than watching TV because you had to use your imagination. It's really very entertaining. I couldn't wait to get home and read my books all the time. And you learn so much, but you're looking at words all the time, so you learn how to spell. You can always tell a reader because they know how to spell. And you have to put those words together, so you learn grammar and syntax, so they write well also. And they have to use their imagination, so they tend to be more creative individuals. And I think all of those things were vital to my success.
Well, thank goodness you had such a great role model there at home. And also the message of education, certainly something that we believe in so much. First of all, I want to thank also everybody who's been watching too, and also to find out about future speakers, everybody, you can go to the globalserviceinstitute.org, globalserviceinstitute.org. And Secretary Ben Carson, what a privilege to have you here with us today. And thank you for your wonderful and inspiring message. Great to have you with us.
It's always great to be with you. This Emmy winning, we can put another Emmy back there.
I need some more in the background, huh? But I'm not a secretary. I'm not a secretary, and I'm not on the coronavirus task force. So you have me beat.
All right. Take care now.
Thank you so much.